It was 1992. You were sitting in a small house in Cambridge, not the Cambridge where Philby was recruited, but a quiet suburban Cambridge with a garden and neighbors who mowed their lawns on Saturdays, watching an MI6 officer open a cardboard box, then a second, then a third. Then he stopped and was silent for a long time. He looked at you, then back at the boxes. The expression on his face was that of a man who had asked for a glass of water and been brought an ocean. You drank your tea, English, with milk, you were used to it by now, and waited for him to finish comprehending. There were 25,000 pages, handwritten, precise, names, pseudonyms, operations, agent networks, safe houses, codes, the entire history of Soviet intelligence for 40 years, painstakingly copied by one man in a provincial KGB archive and smuggled out of the country in a milk churn. In a milk churn, Carl. MI6 had never received anything like it in its entire history. Neither had the CIA. No one ever had. The officer finally spoke, quietly, almost a whisper. "My God, Vasily. How long did this take you?" You thought for a second. Replied, 12 years. He nodded, looked at the boxes, back at you. Did you understand what you were doing? You looked at him with that expression you used to call archival. Calm, precise, devoid of superfluous emotion. I understood what I was doing from day one. That was the whole moment. No explosion, no drama. Just tea, boxes, and 12 years of work that changed the history of the Cold War. Now let's rewind and understand how a modest archivist with the salary of a mid-level Soviet civil servant became the most productive source in the history of Western intelligence. Spoiler, it wasn't for money, and not for ideology, in the way Philby and his Cambridge friends understood it. It was for something both simpler and more complex at the same time. Moscow, 1956. You are Vasily Nikitich Mitrokin, 32 years old, a KGB foreign intelligence officer, just returned from an assignment abroad. Hungary, 1956. You saw it up close. Not from newspapers, not from official reports. From the inside. Soviet tanks on the streets of Budapest, bodies on the cobblestones, people who 3 days ago believed everything would change, and whom the system crushed over a weekend. You saw how it worked when the mask was removed, and underneath wasn't a bright future, but simply a mechanism of suppression that wouldn't stop. You returned to Moscow, and something inside you shifted. Not loudly, quietly, like the foundation of a building shifts before it slowly begins to settle. You continued to go to work, wrote reports, received your salary. But something was already wrong. Then came 1961. Khrushchev closed the foreign departments. A reorganization led to your transfer. Not a promotion, not an investigation, just to a different place, to the archive. The KGB's first chief directorate, archival sector. An operational officer became an archivist. It sounded like a demotion, and by Soviet rank standards it was. Colleagues looked on with sympathy, some with ill-concealed glee, others. You sat down at a desk in the storage facility, picked up the first folder, and began to work. And right here, remember this moment, because this is where everything else began. The KGB archive was not a boring place where dusty folders lay in alphabetical order. It was the entire dark history of the Soviet state, packaged in cardboard and bindings. Every foreign intelligence operation since the 1920s. Every agent recruited in the West. Every traitor found and eliminated. Every disinformation operation. Every political assassination. Every attempt to influence elections in foreign countries. All of it lay before you in neat folders marked secret. You read. And the more you read, the clearer you understood. What you saw in Hungary was not an accident or a system error. It was the system, in all its glory, documented, filed, numbered. Your immediate superior in the archive, Colonel Semyon Andreevich Gromov, a 60-year-old man with a brush mustache and a habit of drinking tea from a saucer, approached his work with that particular Soviet meticulousness bordering on affection. He knew the archive like his own apartment, able to find any document in 5 minutes without a catalog. Once, around 1963, after you'd worked there for 2 years, he said to you over tea, "Mitrokin, you read too carefully." Not threateningly, just an observation. You replied, "Habit, Semyon Andreevich. I'm precise." Gromov nodded, drank from his saucer, said, "Precision is a good quality." He stood up and left. You sat and wondered, did he notice or not? You decided, no, you were wrong. But Gromov turned out to be one of those people who notice and keep silent, for various reasons. That would become clear later. 1965. You were appointed senior archivist, a paradoxical career for a man sent to the archive as a demotion. Now you had access to top-secret materials, Operation Sword and Shield, the KGB's internal doctrine on working with foreign agents. Full lists of Soviet illegals operating in the USA and Western Europe, not pseudonyms, but real names, cover legends, addresses, materials on operations against émigré organizations, NTS, OUN, others, what was done to them, how they were discredited, who was killed, and how it was documented. Files on specific individuals, living people who at that moment were living in London, Paris, New York, unaware that in a Moscow archive there was a folder with their name and plans concerning their future lives. And it was then, not immediately, but gradually, like a decision that is made slowly but at some point turns out to have already been made, that you began to record, not copy. Copying machines in the archive were strictly accounted for, every sheet registered. You recorded by hand, in a notebook, in small, neat letters. You always wrote neatly. Everyone who worked with you noted that. At first, just for yourself, like notes, as if you wanted to remember. Then, methodically, systematically, with the understanding of what you were doing and why. The first notebook filled in a month. You brought it home in your coat pocket, hid it under a floorboard in your country house. You had a small dacha outside Moscow, a typical unpretentious Soviet country retreat. You sat in the kitchen, drank tea, went to bed. In the morning, you got up, went to work, and took a new notebook. Do you understand the paradox of the Soviet security system? It was built against external threats, spies infiltrating across the border, agents recruited by foreign intelligence, dissidents communicating with journalists. Against an internal threat in the form of a quiet, elderly archivist methodically copying documents into a notebook and taking them home, there was no system. Because it never occurred to anyone that such a thing was even possible. Why? What would you do with those notebooks? Sell them to Western intelligence agencies? How? A Soviet citizen with no right to travel abroad, no contacts in the West, under surveillance due to his place of work. Theoretically impossible. Practically, 12 years and 25,000 pages. 1970. You'd been working for 9 years and had developed a system. You took 2 notebooks to work. One official for work notes that could be checked, the second in another pocket for something else. You sat in the storage facility, opened a folder, read, made official notes in your usual handwriting. Then, you moved to a distant table under the pretext of working with voluminous materials, took out the second notebook, and wrote from memory what you had just read. Not everything, just the key points. Names, pseudonyms, operations, dates. You developed a system of abbreviations that only you understood. Not a cipher, just personal notations that looked like working notes to anyone who might glance over your shoulder. Your writing speed was phenomenal. Your accuracy, you checked it yourself, reread, corrected. You were an archivist by nature, by calling, and this calling was now working against the system you served. There was one moment, around 1972, that could have ended everything. A routine check of employees' personal belongings upon leaving the building. Not frequent, not systematic. Just a scheduled check, once every few months. A random selection. You were chosen. You stood by the security desk. A young lieutenant with such a bored expression that it was clear. For him, this was routine. He wanted to go home. He'd check your bag now and go have dinner. In your bag was the notebook with your notes. You knew it. The lieutenant opened the bag, flipped through the notebook. A few seconds without interest, closed it, nodded. Go ahead, Vasily Nikitich. You walked out onto the street, reached the corner, stopped. Stood for about 3 minutes just breathing the frosty Moscow air. Then you went to the bus. At home, you drank vodka, the first time in a long while. Went to bed. In the morning, you got up, went to work, and took a new notebook. Do you understand what saved you? Not luck, although that too. What saved you was that you looked exactly as a mid-level Soviet archivist should look. Quiet, neat, a little boring, with folders under your arm and the preoccupied air of a man who needed to sort through another batch of paperwork. You were invisible. Not because you were hiding, but because you perfectly matched what the people around you expected to see. A gray man in a gray institution with gray folders. Philby used a proper accent and a Cambridge diploma. You used Soviet averageness. Different tools, the same logic. 1972, 1975, 1978. The notebooks accumulated under the floorboard in the dacha. You wrapped them in oilcloth against dampness. Then in an additional layer, in case the roof leaked. Then you found a tin container, more reliable. The volume grew. One floorboard wasn't enough. You re-hid them in the cellar. It was dry, dark, good there. Your dacha neighbors, the Kovalenkos, a retired couple who grew tomatoes and kept a goat, sometimes saw you tinkering around the house with tools. They thought, a handyman, fixing something. They thought correctly, in a way. 1980. You had been working in the archive for 19 years, dozens of notebooks, an enormous amount of information, and you understood with increasing clarity, this mass needed to be taken out. Not because you feared it would be found at the dacha. It could be found at any moment, and that would be the end. But because these records only made sense if they reached where they were supposed to reach. Otherwise, just a manuscript under a floorboard, a paranoiac's personal archive. But how? You were a Soviet citizen, a KGB officer, without an exit visa, without contacts in the West, without a cover story. You weren't Philby. You didn't have a Soviet cargo ship waiting in port. You had a dacha, notebooks, and the Kovalenkos' goat. And here, remember this moment, you made a decision that seemed insane and indeed was insane, but a cold and calculating insanity. You decided to wait. Not for a year or two, but for as long as it took, to wait for the moment when the system would crack widely enough for you to get through. You believed it would happen. Not out of optimism, but out of logic. The system you had observed from the inside for 20 years was a system where everything was rotting. The paperwork showed the reality, and the reality said that things couldn't last like this. You waited. 1985. Gorbachev. Glasnost. Perestroika. Words that at first seemed as empty as all Soviet words. Ritualistic, beautiful, non-binding. You read the newspapers with the same expression with which you read archive folders. Carefully, unemotionally, searching for specifics behind the general formulations. And gradually, very slowly, with setbacks and contradictions, you began to see. Something was changing. Truly changing. Not everything and not quickly. But a crack had appeared. 1988. You were 64. Not long until retirement. After retirement, travel restrictions for former KGB officers, standard practice, several years under surveillance, no trips abroad. Meaning the window was closing. You decided to accelerate. And here begins the story of the milk churn, the very story that would later enter intelligence textbooks as an example of such a simple solution that professionals read it and don't believe it. In the village near your dacha, an ordinary Russian village, mud, fences, chickens on the road, locals transported milk to the market in large metal churns. Standard Soviet churns, 10-liter with a latched lid. You bought several, an ordinary purchase. Who would look twice at a man buying milk churns in a village? You transferred the notebooks from the cellar into the churns. You buried the churns in the garden, deeper in different spots, carefully, precisely. On top you planted potatoes, a Soviet garden with potatoes and milk churns containing state secrets underneath. Perfect. No John le Carré could have invented anything better, because this wasn't a spy novel. It was Soviet reality, where the best repository for state secrets was a pensioner's garden. 1988, 1989, the Berlin Wall. You watched television. Soviet television showed it cautiously with correct commentary, and thought, this is it. The crack had become a hole. 1990, the Baltic republics demanded independence. Gorbachev hesitated. The KGB was nervous. You were working your last year before retirement and thought about one thing every day, making it in time. 1991, August, the putsch. 3 days when everything hung by a thread, and then disintegrated over a single weekend. You sat at home and listened to the radio. When it became clear the putsch had failed, you got up, went into the garden, stood over the potato patch. You thought. Went back inside. Called your neighbor Kovalenko to ask for a shovel. The neighbor brought it, without asking why. Kovalenko was a good man, a non-smoker. His tomatoes were excellent. 1991, December. The USSR officially ceased to exist. The KGB was reorganized, chaotically, nervously, with uncertain prospects. You were already retired. Exit restrictions for KGB pensioners, technically still in effect, but the system that enforced them had fragmented into several organizations trying to figure out who was in charge now. A hole in the fence the size of a gate. You began to prepare. 1992, spring. Latvia, now the nearest foreign border. A new independent state. Not yet fully developed border procedures. Everything in flux. You arrived in Riga, officially to visit distant acquaintances. Soviet connections still worked on inertia. In Riga, you went to the British embassy. You asked for a meeting with a consular representative. An ordinary request. A former Soviet citizen. Many such people were circulating in 1992. You were met by a young diplomat, David, about 30, with the look of someone who was still rather bored here and hadn't yet learned not to show. It on his face. You sat opposite him. You said calmly. In English, you had studied the language for 30 years from books. Your accent was heavy, but your vocabulary was good. My name is Vasily Mitrokin. I worked for 30 years in the archive of the first chief directorate of the KGB. I have materials. Many materials. I want to speak with your intelligence. David looked at you. A pause. About 5 seconds. Then he picked up a pen. Asked, "What materials exactly?" You replied, "Everything." He wrote something. Looked up. "Mr. Mitrokin, do you understand what you are saying?" You said, "I have understood what I am saying for 30 years. Now too." David called London that same day. London replied 2 days later. Send samples, verification needed. You returned a week later with a notebook. One, specifically chosen, with materials that MI6 could verify against their own databases. The notebook went to London via diplomatic pouch. 2 weeks later, David met you with a different expression on his face, no longer bored. He said, "London wants to meet in person and they want to know. How many more materials?" You said, "Many, very many, in the garden." David was silent for a moment, asked cautiously, "In the garden?" You explained about the churns. David looked at you for a long time, then said, "Understood." He stood up, left. You heard him calling on the phone in the next room, speaking English quickly and quietly. Then you made out one phrase, "In milk churns in the garden." And the pause that followed. You imagined the face of the person in London hearing that. You almost smiled. The operation to extract you and the materials was organized in 3 weeks. MI6 worked quickly when they understood what they were getting. And they understood quickly, because that one notebook you gave for verification contained information so precise that it was checked against 5 independent sources and matched every time. You and your wife were taken out through Latvia with new documents, quietly, without fanfare, an ordinary emigrant moving to the West. There were thousands of such people in 1992. The churns from the garden were loaded into a car at night. The materials crossed the border separately, as diplomatic cargo, several crates, without inspection. Cambridge, summer 1992. The MI6 officer opens the boxes. He is silent for a long time, looks at you. 12 years? You reply, 12. He nods. Then he says what you hear is the highest praise for your work, without pathos, quietly, almost to himself. This is impossible. It's simply impossible. You drink your tea with milk. You reply, nevertheless. Now let's talk about the contents of the boxes. Because 25,000 pages are not an abstraction, they are specific names, specific operations, specific consequences that unfolded for years afterward. Soviet agents in the United Kingdom, not 2, not 5, but a network that had operated for decades. Names, pseudonyms, periods of activity, what they passed on. MI6 gained the ability to close cases that had been open for 30 years, to understand exactly what had leaked, through whom, when. Several individuals were identified and prosecuted in the 90s, quietly, without public trials. The British dislike noise. Several were already dead. Several were alive and learned they were known, with corresponding consequences for the peace of mind in their final years. Soviet illegals in the USA. A different story and a different scale. The CIA received complete data on agent networks that the KGB had built in America since the 1930s. Not pseudonyms, real identities, cover legends, addresses, communication methods. By 1992, some of these people were living in America as ordinary Americans, with histories, families, jobs. They were found. The processes were quiet. Some were deported. Some agreed to cooperate. Some disappeared into legal shadows. Robert Hansen, a Soviet and then Russian intelligence agent in the FBI, one of the most productive Soviet sources within American special services, was identified partly thanks to the materials you carried out in your notebooks. He was arrested in 2001, given a life sentence. He died in prison in 2023. Your notebooks outlived him. KGB operations against émigré organizations. That's a separate and very dark chapter. The NTS, the National Alliance of Russian Solidarists, an anti-Soviet Russian émigré organization. The KGB worked against it for decades. They infiltrated agents, discredited leaders, organized provocations. In your materials, the complete history of this work. The names of those who were recruited within the organization. The names of those who were planned for physical elimination and the execution of those plans. Also documented. Murders that were classified as accidents received different documentation. Operation Progress. The KGB's work to compromise Western politicians by planting documents, recruiting journalists, and creating false sources for Western media. Specific cases, specific names of journalists who worked with Soviet disinformation, some knowing it, some not. When the materials became known, several careers ended. Without a fuss, they just ended. The KGB's work in third world countries, Africa, Latin America, Asia, agent networks and governments, military contacts, financial channels. MI6 and the CIA received a map of Soviet influence in regions where they lacked their own agents. This changed the operational picture in several countries at once. Who was really making decisions? Who was a Soviet asset? Who was simply taking money and pretending? But the most important thing in your materials was not specific names. The most important thing was the methodology. How the KGB selected targets for recruitment. How they built legends for illegals. How they used diplomatic cover. how they organized dead drops and communication systems. This was a textbook of Soviet intelligence written from the inside, and MI6 and the CIA used it for years to understand how the adversary thought and operated. The price of this understanding is hard to measure, not in money, but in decisions that were made correctly because the methodology was understood. 1992 to 1996. MI6 worked with your materials like a mountain that had to be dismantled stone by stone. You sat in Cambridge, helping to decipher your abbreviations. Only you knew what some of them meant. Answering questions, clarifying context. Life was quiet, private, without your name in the newspapers. MI6 preferred it that way. The source was alive, cooperating, no need to attract attention. You received British citizenship. You lived in a suburban house with a garden. You probably learned to mow the lawn on Saturdays. In 1996, when it became clear that Russian intelligence would soon learn of your existence if they didn't already, a decision was made for partial declassification. Journalist Christopher Andrew gained access to the materials and wrote a book, The Mitrokhin Archive. It was published in 1999. The scandal was real, international. Several countries officially summoned British ambassadors. Russia called you a traitor, officially, through the Foreign Ministry. India had a quiet conversation with London about several names that appeared there. Italy dealt with the story of Soviet money that had gone to the Italian Communist Party for decades. You documented the amounts, dates, channels. There was one conversation, already in 1998, shortly before the book's release, that you recall differently depending on your mood. An MI6 officer, a different one now, David had long since transferred elsewhere, asked directly, "Vasily, have you ever regretted anything? Anything in this story?" You thought, "Not long? 5 seconds?" You replied, "About the time. I started too late." The officer was silent, asked, "Only about the time?" You answered, "Only." He nodded, wrote something down. You don't know what it was. The honest answer, it's more complex. There are things in those folders that you read for 30 years and meticulously copied into notebooks. Things you saw as documents, as facts, as material for work. And sometimes at night, in the Cambridge house with the garden, they returned not as documents, but as people. Specific people with specific names from specific folders, whom the system had ground down, and whom you had only seen as the final entry in a file. You didn't save them. You were an archivist, not an operative. By the time the file reached you, it was already too late. You preserved the memory of what was done to them. That's not the same as saving, but it's not nothing. The year 2000. The Mitrokhin Archive was a bestseller. Christopher Andrew received awards. Your name was in the newspapers. It could no longer be hidden. In Russia, you were called a traitor, with the kind of intonation used for people they very much wanted to catch but couldn't. You lived in Cambridge, mowed your lawn, drank tea with milk. 2004, January, you died in the hospital of heart failure, 80 years old. MI6 released a short statement, warm, precise, with the right words. In Russia, silence, officially. Unofficially, those who knew, knew. That's it. 30 years in the archive, 12 years of notebooks, milk churns in a potato garden, 25,000 pages that changed the operational balance of the Cold War. Not in one day, not with one operation, but slowly, methodically, one name and one folder at a time. You weren't Philby. You didn't have a Cambridge diploma or a proper accent. You had precision, patience, and a quiet understanding that the system you served deserved to be seen from the inside. A milk churn. That's the whole story. Sometimes the most impossible hides in the most ordinary.